the physical world suprasensory, just as the human etheric body is suprasensory in relation to the physical body. From this point of view, the human being is an etheric being in an etheric or elemental world. When we become conscious of the fact that we always exist as etheric beings in an elemental world, the awareness of this fact, of which we are ordinarily unconscious, is something quite different from normal experience. This knowledge enters suprasensory cognition. Suprasensory consciousness then knows something that is always there, but is hidden from normal consciousness. In ordinary consciousness, when people wish to refer to the being that presents itself in their physical bodies, they speak of that being as capital I. In the sensory world, then, healthy soul life depends upon feeling oneself separate from the rest of the world. To designate some external process or being as belonging to the I would violate this health. But this is not the case when one experiences oneself as an etheric being in the elemental world. In the elemental world, your own being, your I, merges with certain processes and beings around you. You must, therefore, find your etheric nature in something that is not inner, in the sense that you have become accustomed to understand that concept in the sensory world. Forces, processes, and beings exist in the elemental world that, even though they are in a sense outside, must be considered as if they belonged to one's own I. As an etheric human being, you are woven into the nature of the elemental world. In the physical sensory world, you have your thoughts. These are so close to you that you can regard them as belonging to your I's existence. The interaction of forces and processes in the etheric human being seem just as inner and just as intimate as thoughts in the sensory world, but they do not act like thoughts. They are like beings who live with and in the soul. Therefore, suprasensory cognition needs more inner strength than the soul normally needs to maintain its independence from its thoughts. The fundamental preparation for true spiritual vision, therefore, consists in so strengthening and empowering the soul that it feels itself as an independent being. The soul must feel itself a separate being, not only when it contains thoughts, but also when the powers and beings of the elemental world enter its field of consciousness as part of its own being. The power of the soul, through which it holds its own as an elemental being, is also present in ordinary human life. At first the soul is unaware of this power, but it does have it. To have it knowingly, the soul must arm itself. It must acquire the kind of inner strength of soul that it gains in the preparation for spiritual vision. So long as you cannot commit to developing this inner strength, you will have an understandable dread of admitting your spiritual environment. Unconsciously you will reach for the illusion that the spiritual world does not exist or cannot be known. That illusion will help you past your instinctive dread that your own being, your I, is intertwined or merged with a real outer spiritual world. If you understand the facts described above, you will recognize that there is an etheric human being behind the physical or sensory human being, and an etheric elemental or suprasensory world behind the physical world. Just as in the sensory world, physical consciousness finds thoughts that are not independent and not real, so in the elemental world, clairvoyant consciousness finds real beings that have some degree of independence. As you live into the elemental world, you will begin to see that the partially independent beings exist there in a greater context. Looking at the limbs of the human body, you observe first their partial independence. Then you recognize that they exist as parts within the total body. Suprasensory consciousness will similarly see the individual beings in the elemental world existing as living members of a greater spiritual body. Further suprasensory experience will then lead you to recognize that greater spiritual body as the earth's elemental, suprasensory, living body. The etheric human being feels itself to be a member of this life body of the earth. To advance in spiritual vision in this way is to gain ever deeper insight into the nature of the elemental world. That world is alive with many kinds of beings. You can express the activities of these real beings or forces only by indicating their various characteristics in pictorial form. You will find beings there that are related to everything that seeks duration, density, and weight. We can call them earth souls. If we do not fancy ourselves too clever and are unafraid of images that indicate reality but are not that reality, we could call them gnomes. You will also find beings that, on account of their attributes, we could call air, water, or fire souls. Then there are also other beings. These certainly appear as if they were elemental or etheric beings. But you will recognize that something of a higher kind of reality than that of the elemental world lies hidden in their etheric natures. You will learn that you cannot understand the true nature of those beings with a level of suprasensory knowledge sufficient for the elemental world, any more than you can achieve an understanding of the true nature of the human being with mere physical consciousness. The beings whom we can call earth, water, air, and fire souls stand with their activities in a certain relationship within the earth's life body. There they have their tasks. But their activity reaches beyond the realm of earth. If you come to know them better through suprasensory experience, you and your consciousness will be led beyond the realm of the earth. You will see how this earthly realm is formed from another realm. You will see, too, how spiritual seeds are unfolding within the earth that will, in the future, enable another realm, in a sense a new earth, to arise. In my book titled An Outline of Esoteric Science, I mentioned why that out of which the earth evolved is called Old Moon, and why we call the world toward which the earth is moving Jupiter. It is important to understand these terms correctly. Old Moon refers to a long gone world from which earth was formed by transformation. Jupiter, in the spiritual sense, means a future world toward which earth is now evolving. That's the end of aphorism 4, and here's a small summary. A subtle, etheric human being underlies the human physical body. This etheric being lives in an elemental etheric environment, just as physical human beings live in a physical environment. The elemental environment is part of the suprasensory body of the earth. The earth, for its part, represents the metamorphosis of an ancient world, Old Moon, and is the preparation for a future world, Jupiter. Schematically, we can consider the human being in the following way. 1. The physical body is sensory surroundings through which we recognize ourselves as independent I beings. 2. The subtle etheric body in elemental surroundings through which we recognize ourselves as part of the earth's living body, and thereby indirectly as participating in 3 successive planetary conditions. That's the end of the summary and the end of aphorism 3. This is a reading from The Threshold of the Spiritual World, aphorism 4, entitled Repeated Earthly Lives and Karma, the Human Astral Body and the Spiritual World, Ahrimanic Beings. The soul finds it particularly hard to recognize that something is at work in the life of the soul that is as outside its consciousness as is the ordinary so-called outer world. Believing that this state of affairs might threaten its own independent existence, the soul unconsciously bristles at the knowledge of it. Instinctively it averts its spiritual gaze from it. Although science has recently accepted this fact, at least in theory, the soul has not fully experienced the fact itself, or the consequences of inwardly grasping and imbuing itself with it. Once we achieve a vivid conscious experience of this larger environment to consciousness, we learn to understand that there is an inner kernel in the soul's nature. This kernel is like an independent being in relation to everything that unfolds in the realm of conscious soul life between birth and death. That is, our consciousness discovers a being in its depths whose creation it feels itself to be. At the same time, our consciousness also feels the physical body, its bearer, with all its powers and characteristics, to be the creation of this being. In the course of such an experience, the soul learns to feel a spiritual being ripening within it, a being that evades the influences of conscious life. You come to feel how this inner being grows not only ever stronger, but also more independent during the life between birth and death. You come to recognize that during the life between birth and death, the relationship between this being and the rest of your experience is the same as that between the developing seed and the being of a plant and the complete plant that it becomes. The only difference is that the plant seed has a physical nature, whereas that of the soul is a spiritual one. This experience leads one to think that there are repeated earthly human lives, for within this somewhat independent kernel of its being, the soul feels the seed of a new human life. It feels that after experiencing life after death in the spiritual world, an experience of purely spiritual life conditions that cannot be experienced while one is clothed in an earthly physical body, the seed will carry the fruit of its present life forward into a new life. This thought necessarily gives rise to another, that our present sensory life between birth and death is the result of other long-ago lives on earth. During those lives, the soul developed a seed that after death lived in a purely spiritual world. There it remained until it matured enough to be reborn and begin a new earthly life. The process is like a seed that becomes a new plant. First it separates from the old plant in which it developed in order to live for a time in other life conditions. Then it becomes a new plant. By means of exercises that prepare the soul in an appropriate way, suprasensory consciousness can learn to dip into the process that in a certain way forms an independent kernel in one lifetime, which then guides the fruits of this life over into the next. This guide, having at once the nature of an image and of a being, and as if wishing to reveal itself as a separate being, arises from the waves of the soul as a second self. This second self seems independent, set above the being we previously called myself. It appears to inspire that self. As myself, I flow into the second self that is above and inspiring me. Without knowing anything of it, your ordinary consciousness lives in what suprasensory consciousness recognizes as this state of affairs. Here again your soul must have sufficient strength to hold itself erect. Faced both with a spiritual world with which your soul has merged, and with a spiritual being who you are in a higher sense, but who exists outside, who you feel you are in the sensory... Let me read that again. Faced both with a spiritual world with which your soul has merged, and with a spiritual being who you are in a higher sense, but who exists outside who you feel you are in the sensory world, you must be able to maintain your balance. This second self as image and being rises out of the waves of the soul differently in various individuals. In my plays titled The Portal of Initiation, titled The Soul's Probation, titled The Guardian of the Threshold, and titled The Soul's Awakening, I tried to show how different human individuals work their way through to an experience of this other self. Although the soul in ordinary consciousness feels no inspiration from its other self, Inspiration is nevertheless present in the depths of the soul. But that other self does not make itself known through thoughts or inner words. It acts through deeds, processes, and events. It is this other self that leads the soul through the details of its life destiny and evokes its capacities, tendencies, and talents. The other self lives in the entire destiny of a human life. It accompanies the self that is conditioned by birth and death, and shapes human life with all its joys, exaltation, and pain. Just as physical human beings ordinarily call themselves I, so suprasensory consciousness, when it meets this other self, learns to call the totality of life's destiny I. In this way, what we call by the Eastern word karma unites with the other self, the spiritual I being. Thus the course of our life is inspired by our own permanent being, which continues from life to life. This inspiration works in such a way that the destiny of one earthly life is the consequence of the previous lives. You learn to recognize yourself as another being, so to speak, different from whom you are in sensory existence. This being manifests itself in sensory existence only through its effects. Once our consciousness enters this world, we are in what we can call the realm of the spirit, as distinct from the elemental world. In the realm of the spirit, we find ourselves standing completely outside the circle, where all the experiences and events of the sensory world play themselves out. We look from a different world back toward one we have, in a sense, left behind. But we also come to realize that as human beings we belong to both worlds. We experience the sensory world as a kind of mirror image of the spiritual world. But it is a mirror image in which the processes and beings of the spiritual world are not simply reflected. Rather, it is one in which, though only a reflection, the processes and beings lead independent lives. It is as if you looked at yourself in a mirror, and while looking you saw your reflection take on a life of its own. We come to know the spiritual beings who produce the independent life of this reflected image of the spiritual world. We feel that these spiritual beings originally belonged to the spiritual world, but they left the stage of that world to unfold their field of activity in the sensory world. Thus we find ourselves confronted with two interacting worlds. We can call the spiritual world the world above, and the sensory world the world below. You learn to meet these spiritual beings in the world below by shifting your point of view, as it were, to the world above. One kind of spiritual being presents itself in such a way that you find in these beings the reason we experience the sensory world as material and substantial. Thereby you recognize that all material things are in truth spiritual, and that the spiritual activity of these beings has condensed into matter the spiritual element in the sensory world. Although certain names are at present unpopular, we still need them for what we see as real in the spiritual world. Therefore we shall call the beings who cause materialization in the sensory world Ahrimanic beings. Now, in relation to these Ahrimanic beings, we may say that their own original territory is in the mineral realm, where they rule and where they reveal their full nature. In the plant realm and in the higher realms of nature, Ahrimanic beings achieve something different. This difference first becomes comprehensible when you consider the elemental world. Seen from the realm of the spirit, the elemental world also appears as its reflection. But the reflection of the spiritual realm is not nearly as independent in the elemental world as it is in the physical world of the senses. Ahrimanic spiritual beings have much less influence in the elemental world than they do the sensory world. Nevertheless, out of the elemental world, they develop, among other things, the activity that is expressed in the death and annihilation of existence. Thus we can say that for the higher realms of nature, the task of the Ahrimanic beings is to cause death. To the extent that death is a part of the necessary order of existence, their task is justified. When you observe the activities of Ahrimanic beings from the spiritual realm, you will notice that their activity is connected with something else in the world below. Since their arena is the world below, they do not feel bound to the order that would be proper to their powers in the world above, where they originate. In the world below, they strive for an independence they would never have in the world above. This is particularly visible in the effects Ahrimanic beings have upon human beings as the highest natural realm in the sensory world. Ahrimanic beings seek to make soul life, insofar as this is united with sensory being, independent. They attempt to tear it free from the world above and incorporate it in their own world. As a thinking soul, the human being originates in the world above. The thinking soul that can behold the spiritual world enters that world above. What unfolds in the world of the senses and the thinking related to it bears within it what may be called the influence of Ahrimanic beings. In a way, these beings want to give a kind of eternal existence to sensory thinking in the sense world. Since their forces bring death, they want to wrest the thinking soul from death's clutches and let only the other parts of the human being flow into annihilation. It is their intention that the force of human thinking remain behind in the sensory realm and there take on an increasingly Ahrimanic life. What I just described expresses itself only through its effects in the world below. Human beings may strive to let their thinking souls be permeated by those forces that recognize the spiritual world and live and have their being there, or they may avert their thinking souls from such spiritual forces and use their souls to grasp only the sensory world. The temptation to do the latter comes from the Ahrimanic forces. The end of Aphorism 4. This is a reading from the collected works of Rudolf Штайнер, volume 16-17. I'm reading the second part, entitled The Threshold of the Spiritual World. This is Aphorism 5, titled The Astral Body and Luciferic Beings, the Nature of the Etheric Body. From the viewpoint of the spiritual world, we can observe, in addition to the Ahrimanic beings, spiritual beings of another kind at work. These beings have taken the sensory and elemental worlds as their chosen sphere of action. They are beings who wish to free the feeling soul completely from the sensory world, and in a certain sense to spiritualize it. Life in the sensory world belongs to the cosmic order. While the human soul lives in the sensory world, it undergoes a development appropriate to the sphere of its existence. That the soul is interwoven with the realm of the senses is an effect of the activity of beings that one meets in the world above. The beings who wish to tear the feeling soul from the conditions of sensory reality oppose this activity. These opposing beings will here be called the Luciferic beings. Hence, Luciferic beings have a mode of existence in the sensory world. In a certain way, they catch sight of everything that is ensouled or possessed of feeling, in order to draw it out of the sensory world and incorporate it in a cosmic region akin to their own nature. Viewed from the world above, the effects of these Luciferic beings is also noticeable in the elemental world. Within that, they strive to establish control over a domain of forces that they intend should not be touched by the weight of the sensory world, even though the nature of the world above prescribes that those forces should be woven into the sensory world. Ahrimanic beings stay within their bounds when, according to their function in the cosmic order, they cause only the temporary annihilation of existence. Similarly, Luciferic beings do not overstep the boundaries of their realm when they fill the feeling soul with forces that enable it to find the motivation to rise above the misfortunes of the sensory world and experience itself in relation to them as a free and independent being. But when Luciferic beings wish to create a special realm of the spirit, separate from the general order of the world above, when they wish to translate soul beings in the sensory world into this separate realm, then they do overstep their bounds. You can see how the activity of the Luciferic beings in the sensory world pushes in two directions. On the one hand, these beings must be thanked for the fact that human beings can raise themselves above the simple experience of sensible reality. It is not just the sensible world that fills us with joy and uplifts us. We can find pleasure and elation in what lives in appearance itself, in what transcends the sensory world as the phenomenon of beauty. Seen from this perspective, Luciferic activities have participated in all the important flowerings of culture, especially in the realm of art. Human beings can also live in free thinking. We are not limited to describing sensible things. Our thoughts need not reproduce things with photographic realism. We can also extend creative thinking beyond the sensory. We can philosophize. But an excess of Luciferic forces in the soul can be the source of much fantasy and confusion. In this connection, the soul may seek to unfold its activity without conforming to the conditions of higher cosmic order. Philosophizing without solid insight into the cosmic order, stubbornly thrashing around in arbitrary conceptions, excessive insistence on one's favorite adopted opinion, all of these constitute the shadow side of Luciferic activities. With its other self, the human soul belongs to the world above, but it is also part of existence in the world below. If we have undergone the proper preparation, supra-sensory consciousness can experience itself consciously in the world above. This does not change anything regarding the facts of our situation for suprasensory consciousness. It only gives us conscious knowledge of what we know to be the case for every human soul. Every human soul belongs to the world above. But when human beings live in the sensory world, each soul is allocated a physical body, which is subject to the processes of that world. In addition, the soul is given a subtle, etheric body that lives within the processes of the elemental world. The powers of the Ahrimanic and Luciferic beings act upon the physical and the etheric bodies. Those powers are spiritual, suprasensory in nature. To the extent that the human soul lives in the spiritual world above, it is what is known, if I may be permitted to use the expression, as an astral being. There are many reasons that justify using the expression astral being. For instance, the astral nature of the human being as such is not subject to the conditions effective within the sphere of the earth. Spiritual science recognizes that the laws that must be taken into consideration in the human astral being are not the earthly laws of nature, but the laws at work in the processes of the world of the stars. The use of the term astral body, therefore, seems justified. To the recognition of the physical sensory body and the subtle etheric body, therefore, we must now add a third human body, the astral body. In connection with its primal nature, the human astral body has its roots in the world above, that is, in the real spiritual realm. Within that realm it is a being like others who have their sphere of activity in that spiritual world, To the extent that the elemental and sensory worlds are reflections of the spiritual world, we must consider the etheric and physical human bodies to be reflections of the human astral nature. However, in the etheric and physical bodies, forces derived from luciferic and Ahrimanic beings are at work. Since those beings are of spiritual origin, it is natural that we find in the physical and etheric bodies something of an astral nature. Indeed, students can easily mistake the astral element in the physical and etheric bodies for the actual astral body. Let me read that again. Indeed, students can easily mistake the astral element in the physical and etheric bodies for the actual astral body. This is the result of a spiritual perspective that simply accepts the pictures of suprasensory consciousness and cannot understand their meaning. Yet this mistaken, quote-unquote, astral body is precisely the part of human nature that directs our actions against the lawfulness that truly fits human beings in the cosmic order. Misunderstandings and confusion in this area arise so easily because the attainment of knowledge of the astral nature of the soul is quite impossible for ordinary human consciousness. Nor is such knowledge attainable at the first stages of suprasensory consciousness. Consciousness of our true astral nature is attained only when we experience ourselves in our etheric bodies. For it is in the etheric body that we see the reflected image of our other self, and the world above to which we belong. We see the etheric reflection of the astral body, together with the luciferic and Ahrimanic beings it contains. Later aphorisms will show that the I that people in ordinary life consider to be their essence is not the true I, but a reflection of the true I in the physical world. From the viewpoint of the etheric reflection of the astral body can likewise produce an illusion of a real astral body. As a consequence of growing accustomed to the world above, suprasensory consciousness also gains true insight into how the world below reflects the world above in human beings. It becomes clear that the subtle etheric body, as people bear it in their present earthly existence, is not really the reflected image of what corresponds to it in the world above. It is altered by the activities of the luciferic and Ahrimanic beings. The spiritual archetype of the etheric body cannot fully reflect itself in us on earth because of the activity of the luciferic and Ahrimanic powers in terrestrial nature. When suprasensory consciousness travels beyond the earth to a sphere where a complete reflection of the primal image of the etheric body is possible, it finds itself before its present earthly state, before even its previous moon state, in a far distant past. For this we need to grasp how our present earth developed out of a moon stage, and how that moon stage developed out of a sun stage. In my book titled An Outline of Esoteric Science, I explain the use of the terms moon stage and sun stage. Prior to reaching its present stage of development, the earth was once at a sun stage, and it developed out of this into a moon stage, and then it became earth. During the sun stage, the human etheric body was a pure reflection of the spiritual processes and beings of the world of its origins. For suprasensory consciousness, it is clear that those beings consist entirely of unalloyed wisdom. Thus we can say that during the sun period of the earth, in a far distant past, we received our etheric bodies as a pure reflection of cosmic wisdom beings. And during the following moon and earth periods, the etheric body changed to become what it now is in human nature. That is the end of aphorism 5. There is a following summary. Within us, we bear a psychic center to our being that belongs to a spiritual world. This center is our permanent human essence. It unfolds through repeated earthly lives. During one earthly life, it develops as an independent being within our ordinary consciousness. Then, following physical death, it lives in a purely spiritual world. After the appropriate amount of time, the results of that previous earthly life are reborn in a new earthly life. Because each earthly life follows as the consequence, founded in cosmic order, of the previous one, this permanent center becomes the inspirer of our destiny. Each human being is this permanent entity. We live in this entity as though it were another self. To the extent that as beings we are that other self, we live in an astral body just as we live in a physical and an etheric body. Just as the environment of the physical body is the physical world and that of the etheric body is the elemental world, so the surroundings of the astral body are the spiritual realm. Beings of the same kind and origin as our other self act in the physical and the elemental worlds as Ahrimanic and Luciferic powers. We can understand the relationship of our astral body to the etheric and physical bodies by observing how those powers act. The original source of the etheric body is to be sought for in a long past state of the earth, its so-called sun period. Schematically, we may observe within ourselves the following relations. A. The physical body in the physical sensible environment through which we recognize ourselves as independent beings, I. B. The subtle etheric body in the elemental environment through which we recognize ourselves as a part of the body of earthly life, and thus indirectly as a part of a series of 3 sequential planetary states. C. The astral body in a pure spiritual environment through which we are part of a spiritual world of which the elemental and physical worlds are reflections. Our other self lies in that world and comes to expression through repeated earthly lives. And that is the end of Aphorism 5 and the following summary. This is a reading of the book by Rudolf Штайнер, The Threshold of the Spiritual World. This is Aphorism 6, entitled The Guardian of the Threshold, Some Characteristics of Suprasensory Consciousness. Our experience in the sensory world places us outside the spiritual world, where, as we have seen, our nature is rooted. We can understand the part sensory experience plays in human nature when we remember that to enter the suprasensory worlds with suprasensory consciousness, we must strengthen precisely those soul powers that we can acquire only in the sensory world. When its powers have not been strengthened in this way, the soul feels a certain dread of entering the suprasensory world. To escape having to make such an entry, the soul will even search for quote-unquote proofs to establish that entry is in fact impossible. If the soul is strong enough to enter the suprasensory worlds, it will, when it enters, find in itself the powers that will allow it to assert itself as an independent being. It will, then, experience in the field of its consciousness not only thoughts, but also beings. Such is the nature of the elemental and spiritual worlds. It will also feel that it could have gathered the forces needed for this only in life in the sensory world. Then it will realize why it had to be led through the sensory world on its journey through the cosmos. This insight occurs particularly through suprasensory consciousness's experience of thinking. When you enter the elemental world, your consciousness becomes filled with beings that you perceive pictorially, but you cannot develop an inner activity in relation to these beings in the elemental world that is like the life of thought you develop in the sensory world. And yet it would be impossible to find your way in this elemental world if you did not enter it through thinking. This is what it means to be a human being. Without thinking, you could certainly see the beings of the elemental world, but you would not really know who any of them were. You would be like a person who is faced with a text that he or she could not read. The eyes of a person who cannot read see exactly the same thing as the eyes of one who can, but the writing has meaning and substance only for a reader. The activity of thinking, exercised by suprasensory consciousness during its sojourn in the elemental world, is by no means the same as that which occurs in the sensory world. Rather, when correctly beholding the elemental world, a thinking being, for instance, a human being, perceives the meaning of the world's powers and beings. A non-thinking being would perceive only images without understanding their meaning and real nature. If, when you enter the spiritual world, you do not see with your soul as a thinking being, you might well, for example, take the Ahrimanic beings for something quite different from what they are. The same is true also of the Luciferic and other beings of the spiritual world. But a clairvoyant gaze in the spiritual world, strengthened through thinking, will see Ahrimanic and Luciferic beings for what they are. If you view the spiritual world armed with insufficiently powerful thinking, then Luciferic beings will gain control of the clairvoyant world of images. They create the illusion in the observing soul that it is penetrating deeper and deeper into the spiritual world it seeks. In actuality, however, the soul is just sinking deeper into the world that the Luciferic powers are preparing, a world of the same nature as their own. In such a case, the soul would certainly feel as if it was becoming increasingly independent, but in fact it would be growing accustomed to a spiritual world that did not correspond to its nature and original source. It would be entering a foreign spiritual environment. The sensory world conceals from us such beings as the Luciferic beings and others like them. Therefore, in the sensory world, consciousness cannot be led astray. The deceiving beings are simply not present there for it. Thus it can gain enough strength in its thinking without being confused by them. One of the instinctive characteristics of healthy consciousness is that it will wish to enter the spiritual world only to the extent it has in the sensory world sufficiently strengthened itself to behold it. Consciousness clings to the way it experiences itself in the sensory world. It feels in its element when it can experience the thoughts, feelings, effects, and so on that it owes to the sensory world. How strongly consciousness is attached to those experiences is revealed at the very moment that we truly enter the suprasensory worlds. Just as, at particular moments of our lives, we cling to our most beloved memories, so too, when we enter the suprasensory worlds, all possible tendencies arise of necessity from the depths of our souls. At that moment, we become aware how fundamentally we are bound to the life that connects us with the sensory world. This dependency reveals its full reality, without any of the illusions we otherwise invent for ourselves in our ordinary lives. In a sense, this revelation is our first achievement in the suprasensory worlds. Entering the suprasensory world, we gain a piece of self-knowledge, of which we had hardly any intimation before. We are shown all that we must leave behind if we are to enter in a fully knowing way a world that we in fact inhabit continuously. What we have made of ourselves as human beings, consciously and unconsciously, in the sensory world arises vividly and distinctly before our soul. The result of this experience is that people often let fall away further attempts to enter the suprasensory worlds. They realize with clarity that if their stay in the spiritual world is to be successful, besides leaving behind their attachment to the sensory world, they must learn to feel and perceive very differently. To be successful, then, one must decide to shape a very different inner soul state than one had before. In other words, you must add a new state to the one you have already acquired. But what actually happens at the moment of entering the suprasensory world? You see the being you have always been. But now you no longer see that being from the customary standpoint of the sensory world. Rather, you see yourself from the standpoint of the spiritual world. You see the being you have always been and its reality without illusion. You see it in such a way that you feel yourself permeated with the cognitive powers that can measure that being's spiritual value. When you see yourself in this light, it becomes clear why people dread entering the suprasensory world, and how strong you have to be to enter. You see how you hold yourself back as a knowing being. In fact, the more accurately you see through yourself in this way, the more strongly the tendency arises to remain in the sensory world with the consciousness connected to it. Heightened knowledge coaxes those tendencies out of their hiding places in the depths of your soul. You must cognize these tendencies. Only that can overcome them. But it is above all in that act of cognition that your tendencies most powerfully demonstrate their strength. They want to overpower your soul. Your soul feels itself drawn down into measureless depths. This moment of self-knowledge is of great seriousness. Too often we philosophize and theorize too much about self-knowledge. This diverts the soul's gaze away from the seriousness connected with the question of self-knowledge. Despite this seriousness, it is immensely satisfying to reflect upon how human nature is organized in such a way that our natural instincts prevent us from entering the spiritual world before we are mature enough. How satisfying it is to know that the first and most important meeting with a being of the suprasensory world is a meeting with the full reality of our own being, which will in turn lead us onward in our development. Concealed within you is a vigilant being who keeps careful, solicitous watch over the border that you must cross when entering the suprasensory world. This spiritual being within you is you yourself. Your ordinary consciousness can no more recognize it than the eye can see itself, EYE. It is the guardian of the threshold of the spiritual world. When you experience the sense that you are not only that being, but also outside that being, facing it, in that moment you recognize the guardian. As with other experiences in the suprasensory world, it is the soul's strengthened and strengthening capacities that make the guardian of the threshold visible. Although clairvoyant vision requires that meeting the guardian be raised into knowledge, meeting the guardian is certainly not an event that occurs only to those able to behold the spirit. The same situation occurs for all human beings every time they go to sleep. For then we are all confronted by ourselves, which is exactly the same as standing before the guardian of the threshold. This lasts just as long as we are asleep, for in sleep the soul rises to its suprasensory essence. But the soul's inner strengths are not of themselves enough to call forth the consciousness of this. To understand suprasensory experience, particularly in its tender beginnings, it is very important that the soul attend to the fact that it may already have begun to have suprasensory experiences without being able to form any knowledge of them worth speaking of. Clairvoyance begins very delicately. People often expect to see things they could reach out and touch, and they therefore pay no attention to the clairvoyant impressions that flit past. Or it may be that they simply do not wish to acknowledge these impressions as clairvoyant. Certainly they occur in such a way that their very appearance prepares you to forget them. Such clairvoyant impressions enter the realm of consciousness so faintly that they can remain quite unnoticed, like pale clouds in the soul. Because clairvoyance begins so delicately, and because people usually have misleading expectations regarding intuitions of the spirit, many people who seriously seek the spiritual world will at least at first miss it. Here again, encounter with the guardian of the threshold is important. If you have strengthened your soul for self-knowledge, then meeting with the guardian can be no more than a first delicate flitting past of spiritual perception. You will not, however, forget it as easily as you might forget other suprasensory impressions, because you are more strongly interested in your own nature than in other things. On the other hand, the encounter with the guardian is not necessarily among the first suprasensory experiences. Strengthening of the soul can take various directions, and the path the soul takes can lead it first to other beings or processes in the spiritual field of vision. Nevertheless, relatively soon after you have entered into the suprasensory world, this meeting with the guardian will occur. The end of Aphorism 6. This is a reading of the book by Rudolf Штайнер, The Threshold of the Spiritual World. This is Aphorism 7, entitled I, capital feeling, I feeling, the human soul's capacity to love, and their relationship to the elemental world. When the soul consciously enters the elemental world, it finds itself forced to change many of the ideas gained in the sensory world. If you have strengthened the soul's powers appropriately, you will be able to make such changes. Indeed, you must attain that strength of soul and not shy away from doing so. Otherwise, when you enter the elemental world, you will be overwhelmed by the feeling that you are losing the solid ground the solid ground needed to build up will in your inner life. Unless you hold on to them as tightly as you did when you gained them, the ideas you gained in the physical sensory world will not impede your entry into the elemental world. You cling to these ideas only because your soul has the habit of doing so. For a consciousness that initially experienced only the sensory world, it is completely natural that it should become accustomed to taking the form of ideas developed there as the only one possible. In fact, it is more than natural. It is necessary. The life of the soul would never achieve the inner unity and the stability it needed if it did not develop its consciousness in a sensory world ruled by fixed and necessary ideas. Everything given to the soul by living in the sensory world aids it in entering the elemental world without losing its independent, self-contained, and stable nature. We must therefore strengthen and empower our soul life. Then, when the soul enters the elemental world, its independence is not held unconsciously, but is held clearly and consciously. If the soul is too weak to experience the elemental world consciously, then when it enters that world, its independence disappears, just as a thought disappears when impressed so feebly on the soul that it does not live on in the memory. A weak soul of this kind cannot enter the suprasensory world consciously. Each time a weak soul tries to enter the suprasensory world, the being in the soul, whom we call the guardian of the threshold, throws it back into the sensory world. And if, in the attempt, the soul gets a taste of the suprasensory world that it still remembers after sinking back into the sensory world, then this prize from another realm can confuse its thinking. It is, however, quite impossible to fall into such confusion if one cultivates the kind of healthy power of judgment that can be acquired in the sensory world. By strengthening our powers of judgment, we develop the soul's proper relationship to the processes and beings of the suprasensory worlds. To live in those worlds consciously, the soul must possess a natural tendency that it cannot develop as fully in the sensory world as it can in the suprasensory worlds. This tendency is unreserved devotion to what you experience, You must dive down into experience and be able to unite with it. And you must be able to do that to such a degree that you see yourself outside your own nature and feel yourself within another. Your own being must transform into the one you are experiencing. Without this capacity for transformation, you cannot experience anything genuine in the suprasensory worlds. For the basis of all experience in the suprasensory worlds is the conscious knowledge that says, now I have transformed myself in a particular way. I am united vitally with another being whose nature has thus transformed me. To transform yourself in this way, to feel yourself into another being, is to live in the suprasensory worlds. You come to know the beings and processes of those worlds. You notice that how you relate to a particular being is especially dependent upon how close its nature is to your own. Distinct shades of experience arise that, especially in the elemental world, one could characterize as sympathy and antipathy. For instance, when meeting an elemental being or process, you may feel a sympathetic experience arising in your soul. Through this experience of sympathy, you come to understand the nature of that being or process. Do not imagine, however, that these experiences of sympathy or antipathy differ only in strength or degree of intensity. In the physical world, you may indeed speak of experiences of sympathy and antipathy as being only stronger or weaker. But in the elemental world, you can differentiate sympathies and antipathies not simply by their strength, but also by their color. Just as you experience the sensory world as many-colored, likewise will you experience the elemental world as manifoldly sympathetic and antipathetic. Here we must remember, too, that in the realm of elemental beings, antipathetic does not connote that we inwardly turn away from something. Antipathetic simply refers a characteristic of an elemental being or process that relates to a sympathetic characteristic of another process or being, as the color blue relates to red in the sensory world. We can speak of a sense that people can awaken in their etheric bodies for seeing the elemental world. That sense can perceive sympathies and antipathies in the elemental world, just as the eye, EYE, perceives colors, or the ear tones in the sensory world. Just as in the sensory world one object is red and another blue, to spiritual sight some beings of the elemental world radiate a kind of sympathy and others a kind of antipathy. This experience of the elemental world through sympathy and antipathy, again, does not occur only to the supersensibly awakened soul. It is always present in every human soul. It belongs to the nature of the human soul. In ordinary life, however, knowledge of this part of human nature is not developed. People have within them an etheric body, and this connects them in hundreds of ways with the beings and processes of the elemental world. At one moment we are interwoven with certain sympathies and antipathies in the elemental world, and at another moment with others. The soul cannot live constantly as an etheric being, and so the sympathies and antipathies are not always active in the elemental world in a clearly articulated way. In sensory existence, the states of waking and sleeping must alternate. Likewise, in the elemental world, the soul's experience of sympathies and antipathies must have an opposite state. The soul can withdraw from all sympathies and antipathies and inwardly experience only itself. That is, it can consider and feel only its own being. That feeling of self-being may become so intense that we can speak of willing our own being. The state of the soul in its own pure original nature is not easily portrayed. Other than the soul's strong pure sense of self, or capital I feeling, There is nothing like it in the sensory world. Indeed, we can describe that state as it is experienced in the elemental world only by saying that the soul's necessary devotion to experiences of sympathy and antipathy causes it to feel the urge to say to itself, I will be wholly for me. I will be only in me. Only by a kind of unfolding of the will can the soul wrench itself from its state of unreserved devotion to the experiences of sympathy and antipathy in the elemental world. In the elemental world, this living in oneself is like the state of sleep, whereas devotion to processes and beings corresponds to the waking state. If the human soul is awake in the elemental world and develops the will to experience itself, that is, if it feels a need for elemental sleep, it can achieve that self-experience by returning to the waking state of sensory life with a fully developed feeling of self. For when saturated by the feeling of self, the experience of the sensory world is nothing other than elemental sleep. It is the freeing of the soul from elemental experiences. It is literally true to say that for suprasensory consciousness, the life of the soul in the sensory world is a spiritual sleep. A person who, having developed spiritual vision in the right way, awakens in the suprasensory world will retain the memory of soul experiences in the sensory world. If you did not retain that memory, other beings and processes would be present in your clairvoyant consciousness, but your own being would not. You would then have no knowledge of yourself. You yourself would not live spiritually, but other beings and processes would live in your soul. Thinking this through, you will understand why a properly developed clairvoyant must place significant value upon developing a strong capital I feeling. The I feeling, developed in connection with clairvoyance, certainly does not first come about through clairvoyance. Clairvoyance simply helps us learn to recognize what was always present in the depths of our soul, but remained unconscious for ordinary sensory life. Strong I feeling comes about not through the etheric body, but through the soul's experience of the physical sensory body. If the soul does not bring this I feeling, developed through its experiences in the sensory world, into the clairvoyant state, it will soon become evident that the soul is inadequately prepared for the experience of the elemental world. But an essential characteristic of human consciousness in the sensory world requires that the soul's self-feeling, its I experience, though present, be muted. This gives the soul the opportunity to experience in the sensory world training in the noblest moral force, compassion. If a strong sense of self were to dominate the soul's conscious experiences in the sensory world, then moral instincts and ideas could not develop properly. They could not bring forth the fruit that is love. Devotion, a natural impulse in the elemental world, is not the same as what we call love in normal human experience. Elemental devotion is based on an experience of oneself in another being or process. Love is an experience of the other in one's own soul. To experience love, however, a sort of veil must be drawn in the soul over the self-feeling or I experience present in its depths. Then, because its own powers are muted, the joys and sorrows of the other arise in the soul. In this way, love, which is the source of the most genuine moral impulse in human life, germinates. Love is for us the most important fruit of human experience in the sensory world. If you penetrate the nature of love, or compassion, you will discover how the spiritual expresses its truth in the sensory world. I have already said that it is in the nature of the suprasensory to transform itself into something else. If the spiritual in physical human life transforms itself in such a way that the sense of self is muted and then rises up as love, then the spiritual remains true to its own elemental laws. We can say that with suprasensory consciousness, the human soul awakens in the spiritual world. But we must also say that through love, the spirit awakens in the sensory world. Wherever love and compassion are active in life, we can perceive the magic breath of the spirit blowing through the sensory world. Therefore, when properly developed, clairvoyance never blunts love and compassion. The more the soul becomes properly accustomed to the spiritual worlds, the more it will feel lovelessness and the lack of empathy and compassion as a denial of the spirit itself. The experiences of a consciousness on its way to clairvoyance demonstrate quite particular characteristics. The I feeling required for experience in the suprasensory worlds is easily muted. Often it is like a faint, guttering out memory. At the same time, as soon as one enters the suprasensory world, feelings of hate or lovelessness, as well as immoral impulses, become strong soul experiences. They present themselves to the soul as accusations that have come alive. They become gruesomely real pictures. In order not to be tortured by those pictures, suprasensory consciousness often grasps after spiritual forces that can weaken their impressions. But these powers then permeate the soul with forces that can spoil the clairvoyance one has gained. They drive clairvoyance away from the good realms of the spiritual world and direct it toward the bad. On the other hand, genuine love and true kindness of the soul are experiences that strengthen consciousness, giving it the forces it needs to enter into clairvoyance. I said that we must prepare the soul before it can have suprasensory experiences. It must be added that a genuine capacity for love and a desire for true human kindness, compassion, and empathy are among the many means of such preparation. An excessive I feeling in the physical world works against morality. A weak I feeling means that the soul that is surrounded with storms of elemental sympathies and antipathies lacks inner certainty and stability. Inner certainty and stability can be present only when a sufficiently strong I feeling rises from experiences in the physical sensory world into the etheric body, even though the etheric body may remain unknown to us in normal life. To develop a genuinely moral attitude in our souls, we must mute the I feeling with tendencies to compassion and love. The end of Aphorism 7. This is a reading of the book The Threshold of the Spiritual World by Rudolf Штайнер. Aphorism 8, entitled The Boundary Between the Sensory and the Suprasensory Worlds. To understand the relationship between the different worlds, we must understand that a force that has to develop its activity according to cosmic order in one world can, when it unfolds in another world, direct its activity against this cosmic order. This is why two opposing powers must be present in the human etheric body: the capacity to transform oneself into other beings, and the strong I feeling or sense of self. In the physical sensory world, these powers in the human soul can be developed only when that life is muted. In the elemental world, however, they balance one another, thereby making human nature possible, just as in the physical world sleeping and waking make human life possible. The relationship between two such counteracting forces could never be such that they extinguish one another. Rather, their relationship must be one in which each is developed and acts to balance the other. I feeling and the capacity to transform oneself into another work on each other in this way only in the elemental world. In the sensory world, only the results of the mutual relationship and interaction of these two forces can be effective within the cosmic order. For If the capacity for transformation, which the etheric body must have, were active in the sensory world, one would feel something in one's soul that did not conform to the physical body. The physical body stamps us firmly in the sensory world. It places us within it as particular personal beings. But the etheric body does not place us in the elemental world in the same way. In order to be a complete human being in the elemental world, a person must be able to take on the most varied forms. Were we unable to do so, we would be condemned there to complete isolation. We could know only ourselves. We would feel unrelated to any other beings or processes. It would be as though in that world no other beings or processes existed. On the other hand, if we develop in the sensory world the same capacity for transformation that we need for the elemental world, then personal identity would be lost. We would live in contradiction with ourselves. In the physical world, this capacity for transformation must remain a force at rest in the depths of the soul. A force that gives the soul its basic mood, but one that does not develop in the sensory world. Suprasensory consciousness must acquire the capacity for transformation. Were it unable to do so, it could not observe in the elemental world. Suprasensory consciousness thus acquires a capacity that it can use only while active in the elemental world, and that it must suppress as soon as it returns to the sensory world. Suprasensory consciousness must therefore always be aware of the boundary between these two worlds. It must not work in the sensory world with capacities that are appropriate only to the suprasensory world. If the soul, knowing it is in the sensory world, were consciously to allow the etheric body's capacity for transformation to continue its activity there, then normal consciousness would be filled with thoughts that do not correspond to sensory reality. The soul's thought life would become confused. Awareness of the boundary between the worlds is a necessary precondition for the proper activity of suprasensory consciousness. Those who wish to achieve suprasensory consciousness must take care that knowledge of the suprasensory worlds does not creep in to disturb ordinary consciousness. By meeting the guardian of the threshold, one gains an understanding of the soul's situation in the sensory world. The meeting shows whether one's soul is sufficiently strong to banish from physical consciousness the suprasensory forces and capacities that should not be active in it. If one enters the suprasensory worlds without the self-knowledge provided by the guardian of the threshold, the experiences of those worlds can be overwhelming. They can force themselves into physical sensory consciousness in the form of illusory images. These images then take on characteristics from the sensory world, with the result that the soul wrongly considers them to be reality. However, developed clairvoyance would never consider images of the elemental world to be real, in the same sense that physical consciousness must consider experiences in the sensory world to be real. Only the soul's capacity for transformation brings the images of the elemental world into the right relationship with their proper corresponding reality. Neither should the second necessary force in the etheric body, the strong I feeling, enter the soul's life in the sensory world in the way that would be appropriate in the elemental world. Were that to happen, it would be the source of immoral inclinations in the sensory world, at least to the extent that such tendencies are connected with egoism. Observing the cosmos, therefore, spiritual science sees in egoism the origin of evil in human activity. One would misunderstand the cosmic order if one were to believe that this order could exist without the forces that form that source of evil. If these powers were not present, the etheric human being could not develop in the elemental world. Indeed, so long as they operate only in the elemental world, such forces are thoroughly good. They cause evil only when they do not remain in the depths of the soul, where they can regulate the relationship of the human being to the elemental world. When these forces are displaced into the soul's experiences in the sensory world, they transform themselves into egoistic impulses. They then act counter to the capacity to love and become the origin of immoral activity. The movement of strong I feeling from the etheric body into the physical body not only strengthens egoism, but also causes the etheric body to weaken. Suprasensory consciousness discovers that as egoism becomes stronger in sensory experience, I feeling becomes weaker in the suprasensory world. In the depths of our souls, we are not strengthened, but weakened by egoism. And when we step through the gates of death, the egoism that we develop in the life between birth and death weakens the soul for experiences in the suprasensory world. The end of Aphorism 8. This is a reading of the book by Rudolf Штайнер, The Threshold of the Spiritual World. Aphorism 9, on the nature of the spiritual worlds. If the soul enters the suprasensory world with suprasensory consciousness, it learns to know itself in a way that is inconceivable in the sensory world. Through its capacity for transformation, the soul discovers that it can perceive beings that are to a greater or lesser degree related to it. Likewise, it becomes aware that in the suprasensory world, it encounters beings to whom it is not only related, but with whom it must compare itself if it is to learn about itself. The soul observes that through their suprasensory experiences, these suprasensory beings have become what the soul itself has become by means of its experiences in the sensory world. For the soul encounters beings in the elemental world who have developed powers and capacities that human beings can develop only because they have, in addition to their other bodies, a physical body. Elemental beings have no physical bodies, but they have developed in such a way that by means of their etheric bodies, their soul is similar to the human soul that is developed through the physical body. These suprasensory beings are somewhat like human beings, but they differ from them in that they are not subject to the conditions of the sensory world. They have no senses of the kind human beings have. Their knowledge is similar to human knowledge, but they have not acquired it through the senses as we do, but by a kind of rising up of thoughts and other soul experiences from the depths of their nature. Their inner life also lies within them. They bring it up from the depths of their souls, just as human beings bring up memories from the depths of their souls. Thus, in the suprasensory world, we can learn to know beings who have become in that world what we can become in the sensory world. Even though they can be like human beings in the ways I have described, these beings nevertheless exist at a higher stage in the cosmic order than we do. They form a realm of reality above humanity, a higher hierarchy of the chain of beings. Despite some similarity, their etheric body differs from that of human beings. Whereas we are woven into the suprasensory life body of earth through the sympathies and antipathies of our etheric bodies, neither these beings nor their psychical lives are bound to the earth. If we observe what those beings experience through their etheric bodies, we shall find that they have experiences in their souls that are similar to our own. They have thinking, they have feelings, they have will. Through their etheric bodies, however, they develop something that human beings can develop only through their physical bodies, consciousness of their own being. As human beings, we would know nothing of suprasensory existence if we did not bring the forces we develop through the physical body into the suprasensory worlds. Suprasensory consciousness learns to understand these beings by gaining the ability to observe with the help of the etheric human body. Suprasensory consciousness raises the human soul into the world where those beings live and act. Not until the soul experiences itself in that world do the images or ideas that provide insight into those beings enter consciousness. For these beings do not participate directly in the physical world, and therefore they do not reach into the human physical body. Experiences that are possible only through the physical body do not exist for them. They are spiritual suprasensory beings, who, one could say, do not set foot in the sensory world. If we do not observe the boundary between the sensory and the suprasensory worlds, we may force to enter our physical consciousness suprasensory images that are not true expressions of those beings. Those pictures arise through an experience of luciferic and ahrimanic beings. These are beings who are similar in nature to the suprasensory beings described previously, but who, in contrast to them, have shifted their field of life and action into the world that human beings can perceive through the senses. Through an experience with the guardian of the threshold, you can learn to pay proper attention to the boundary between the suprasensory and sensory worlds. You can then observe luciferic and ahrimanic beings from the suprasensory world with suprasensory consciousness. Then you will learn to recognize their true nature, and you will learn to distinguish them from the other spiritual beings who have remained within a field of activity appropriate to their nature. It is from this perspective that spiritual science must describe luciferic and ahrimanic beings. The nature of the luciferic beings indicates that their appropriate field of activity lies not in the physical world, but, as it were, in the elemental world. If out of the flood of images in the elemental world, images arise that penetrate the human soul, and if those images enliven the human etheric body without taking on an illusory existence in the soul, then luciferic beings can be present and active in those pictures without violating cosmic order. Ideally, luciferic beings act upon the human soul in a liberating way. They raise the soul in such a way that it is no longer simply interwoven with the sensory world. But if we allow the kind of life that the soul ought to unfold only in the elemental world into the physical world, if we allow our physical feelings to be influenced by antipathies and sympathies that should prevail only in the etheric body, then luciferic beings will gain an influence that is contrary to designs of cosmic order. Such luciferic influence is always present whenever in the sympathies and antipathies of the sensory world a kind of love is active that is not based upon compassion for the life of another sensory being. If you can love a person for the characteristics that he or she brings forth to meet you, then no luciferic element can mix into that love. Love that is founded upon qualities manifesting in sensory existence keeps its distance from the luciferic element. Love that is not grounded in the beloved in this way, but is instead grounded in the person of the lover, tends toward a luciferic influence. If you love someone because he or she has qualities toward which your nature, as the one who loves, tends, you love that person with the part of the soul that luciferic elements can approach. Consequently, we should never say that luciferic elements are always evil, because the human soul must love the processes and beings of the suprasensory worlds luciferically. A contradiction to cosmic order occurs only when we direct toward the sensory world the kind of love that should instead draw us toward the suprasensory world. A love for the suprasensory rightly evokes in the loving being a heightened sense of self. But love sought in the sensory world for the sake of such an increased sense of self amounts to a luciferic temptation. Love of the spiritual, when sought for the sake of self, is freeing in its action. But love of the sensory, when it is sought for one's own sake, does not act to free. Rather, through the gratification of such love, Rather, through the gratification, such love seeks in the sensory world. Such love fetters the self. Ahrimanic beings become apparent in the thinking soul in much the same way that Luciferic beings appear in the feeling soul. They chain thinking to the sensory world. They divert thinking from the reality that thoughts have meaning only when they appear as part of the great order of cosmic thought, which cannot be found in sensory existence. The Ahrimanic element must exist in the world into which human soul life is woven. This element exists as a necessary counterweight to the Luciferic element. Without the Luciferic element, the soul would dream away its life, merely observing sensory existence and finding no reason to rise above it. Without the counteraction of the Ahrimanic element, the soul would fall prey to the Luciferic. It would give very little significance to, and have no desire to learn about, the sensory world, despite the fact that some of the conditions necessary for its existence are in that world. The Ahrimanic element acquires its proper meaning in the human soul when it leads to a life in the sensory world that is appropriate to the soul, when we accept the sensory world for what it is and forego everything in it that is of a transitory nature. Clearly, it is quite wrong to think that to avoid falling victim to the Luciferic and Ahrimanic elements, one should eradicate them in oneself. For instance, if you rooted out the Luciferic element within you, your soul would no longer strive for the suprasensory. Or if you were to destroy the Ahrimanic element, you could no longer give the sensory world its full significance. You can bring yourself into a proper relationship to these elements only by creating a proper counterbalance to each with the other. All the detrimental effects of these beings arise because they occasionally occur in an unrestrained form and are not brought into proper harmony through the counteracting force. The end of Aphorism 9. This is a reading of the book by Rudolf Штайнер entitled The Threshold of the Spiritual World. This is Aphorism 10, entitled Cosmic Beings of the Spiritual Worlds. When clairvoyant consciousness comes to life in the elemental world, it finds beings who can develop a life there that human beings can achieve only within the sensory world. But these beings do not sense their self, their I, in the way human beings do in the sensory world. Much more than we, they penetrate their I with their volition. That is, they will themselves into existence. They experience their existence as something that through their will they give themselves. These beings do not feel, as we humans do, that they bring forth their own thoughts. Rather, they feel that their thoughts are inspired, that they are things that exist not in them but in the cosmos. To such beings, thoughts seem to radiate into their being from the cosmos. These beings can never doubt that their thoughts reflect the pattern of thought that is poured out over the world. They do not think their own thoughts. They think the thoughts of the world. By means of their thoughts, such beings live in cosmic thought. But it must also be said they will themselves. The feeling life of such beings forms according to their willing and thinking. They feel themselves as members of the cosmic whole. At the same time, they feel the need to will themselves in a way that corresponds to this cosmic whole. As a soul, they can see spiritually. As a soul that can see spiritually grows accustomed to the world of these beings, it comes naturally to understand its own thinking, feeling, and willing. In the elemental world, the human soul could not develop in an etheric body its capacities of thinking, feeling, and willing. Willing would remain merely a weak, dreamy force, thinking a vague, fleeting reflection of the world. a sense of self would not even exist. For all these things, a human being must be clothed in a physical body. When the human soul rises above the elemental world into the actual spiritual world, it experiences clairvoyantly conditions that are even more different from the sensory world than are those of the elemental world. In the elemental world, many things still remind us of the sensory world, but in the spiritual world we are faced with completely different relationships. We can accomplish nothing there with only the concepts we can acquire in the sensory world. Nevertheless, it is in the sensory world that we must strengthen our inner soul life, so that from it we can bring into the spiritual world that which makes our stay there possible. If you do not bring a strengthened soul life into the spiritual world, you will simply become unconscious. Your presence of mind there would be something like that of a plant in the sensory world. As a human soul, you must bring into the spiritual world that which, though not existing in the sensory world, still gives evidence there to its existence. You need to be able to form concepts in the sensory world that, though suggested by that world, have no direct correspondence with things or processes in that world. In the spiritual world, anything that is a reflection of something in the sensory world, or that describes some sensory process, is meaningless. Whatever you perceive with your senses or substantiate with concepts applicable to the sensory world does not exist in the spiritual world. In a certain sense, when you enter the spiritual world, you have to leave behind everything that applies to ideas based on the senses. What does remain in the soul when it enters the spiritual world are those thoughts formed in the sensory world that do not correspond to things or processes in it. Among these thoughts, of course, can be those that are mistakenly formed. If such mistakes are present in your consciousness when you enter the spiritual world, their very existence will demonstrate that they do not belong there. They will act so as to impress upon the soul the urge to return to the sensory or the elemental world in order to substitute the right idea for the false one. When, on the other hand, the soul brings correct thoughts into the spiritual world, something in that world that is related to them strives to meet them. The soul feels that beings exist in the spiritual world, the whole of whose inner existence is the same as that of the thoughts in the soul. We might call the body of such beings a thought body. In their thought body, these beings experience themselves as independent, just as human beings in the sensory world experience themselves as independent in the physical body. Some thoughts a human being acquires are permeated with feeling. Thoughts of this kind are appropriate to strengthen the life of the soul so that it can receive an impression of the beings of the spiritual world. First, you must intensify the feeling of devotion that you developed for the sake of the capacity of self-transformation in the elemental world. That is, in your devotion to the being into whom you will transform yourself, you do not experience sympathy or antipathy. Rather, you surrender to that being in such a way that it can live in your soul in its own way. If you strengthen this capacity, the capacity for perception in the spiritual world will arise. In a certain sense, each spiritual being speaks to the soul in its own way. A spiritual interchange thereby arises that consists of a language of thoughts. You experience thoughts, but you know that you experience beings in those thoughts. To live in beings that do not merely express themselves in thoughts, but are present in them with their own being, that is what it means for your soul to live in the spiritual world. Let me read that sentence again. To live in beings that do not merely express themselves in thoughts, but are present in them with their own being, that is what it means for your soul to live in the spiritual world. With regard to beings of the elemental world, the soul feels that cosmic thought is streaming into them, and that they will themselves in accordance with its in-streaming. beings who do not need to step down into the elemental world to develop what human beings develop in the sensory world, but achieve that stage of existence while in the spiritual world, these the soul feels consist entirely of thought substance. The soul has the feeling that cosmic thought does not simply radiate into these beings, but that their being lives in that interweaving of thoughts. They allow cosmic thought to think and live in them completely. Their life unfolds in the perception of the language of cosmic thought. Their will consists of their making themselves manifest in the form of thoughts. Their existence in thought, in turn, has a significant effect upon the universe. Thoughts that are beings speak with other thoughts that are also beings. Human thought life is the reflection of the life of these spiritual thought beings. During the time between death and a new birth, the human soul is as interwoven with the life of those thought beings as it is with the sensory world during physical existence. At birth, or more accurately at conception, when the soul enters sensory existence, its permanent thought nature acts upon it to form or inspire its destiny. What remains of the soul from previous earthly lives works in human destiny, just as the pure living thought beings work in creation. When suprasensory consciousness enters this spiritual world of living thoughts, it feels itself to be in surroundings that are completely different from the sensory world. In the spiritual world, the sensory world is seen as another world, just as, in the sensory world, the spiritual world is another world. For spiritual perception, the sensory world loses everything we perceive of it in sensory existence. All the characteristics and qualities we can comprehend through the senses, or through sense-related reasoning, disappear. On the other hand, from the perspective of the spiritual world, we see that the true primordial nature of the sensory world is itself spiritual. It is from the spiritual rather than from the sensory world that the soul's gaze discovers spiritual beings who unfold their activities so that the universe, which, when looked at through the senses, is the sensory world, arises out of the confluence of their deeds. Seen from the spiritual world, all the characteristics, forces, matter, and so forth of the sensory world disappear. They reveal themselves as mere semblance. From the point of view of the spiritual world, we face only beings. These beings are the true reality. It is the same with the elemental world. When seen from the perspective of the spiritual world, everything there that is not a being disappears. The soul feels that in the elemental world, too, its concern is with beings, who, by letting their activities converge, allow an existence to appear, which, when perceived by the organs of sympathy and antipathy, is the elemental world. An essential aspect of becoming accustomed to the suprasensory worlds is the realization that in place of the states and characteristics that surround our consciousness in the sensory world, there are beings. The suprasensory world is revealed, finally, as a world of beings. Aside from those beings, everything else that exists there is the expression of their deeds. Furthermore, the sensory and elemental worlds also appear as the deeds of those beings. The end of Aphorism 10. This is a reading of the book by Rudolf Штайнер, The Threshold of the Spiritual World. This is Aphorism 11, entitled On the First Rudiments of the Physical Body. In Aphorism 5, I mentioned that moon and sun existences preceded our present earth existence. Only with regard to the moon existence, however, does clairvoyant consciousness receive impressions reminiscent of earth existence. Such impressions cannot be gained when clairvoyant vision turns its gaze backward to the primal distances of the earth's sun existence. For that sun existence reveals itself as a world consisting entirely of beings and their deeds. To receive an impression of sun existence, one must maintain a distance from ideas that can be gained in the earthly realm of mineral and plant life. Such concepts are useful only for understanding the earlier states of the earth itself, or in the case of concepts gained from the plant kingdom, for ancient moon existence. Only concepts stimulated by the animal and human realms can lead to the earth's primordial sun existence. Such concepts, however, must do more than merely picture what the senses perceive as the nature of those realms. Suprasensory consciousness finds within the human etheric body powerful forces that form themselves into images expressing the etheric body's cosmic origins in the deeds of spiritual beings during the old sun period. We can then follow the development from those beginnings through the moon and earth periods. There we find them transformed, and through that transformation they became what we now see as the activity of the human etheric body. Understanding the human physical body demands a different activity of human consciousness. At first, the physical body appears to be simply an outer stamp or impression of the etheric body, but more precise observation reveals that if the physical body were only a sensory physical manifestation of the etheric body, human beings could never have developed their being fully in the sensory world. Had that been the case, a kind of willing feeling and thinking would certainly have arisen, but not of a kind that could be integrated in such a way that a conscious I experience could then arise in the human soul. This becomes especially clear when consciousness begins to develop the characteristics of spiritual seeing. As human beings, we initially develop the I experience only in the sensory world, where we are clothed in physical bodies. Thus sheathed, we can then carry that experience into the elemental world, and further into the spiritual world, thereby penetrating the etheric and astral bodies. As human beings, we have initially etheric and astral bodies in which I experience does not take shape. It is in the physical body that I experience must first occur. Indeed, when we consider the physical body from the perspective of the spiritual world, we can see that it contains something essential, whose truth is not fully revealed even in the spiritual world. When consciousness clairvoyantly enters the spiritual world, the soul becomes accustomed to the world of thought reality. There, it is the I experience alone which enters that world by an appropriate strengthening of the soul that is not woven simply out of cosmic thoughts. I experience finds nothing in its surroundings akin to its own nature in the world of cosmic thought. To feel something of that sort, the soul must continue its path in the suprasensory. On its journey into the suprasensory, the soul must arrive at experiences in which thoughts abandon it, where all sensory experience and all experiences of thinking, feeling, and willing lie, as it were, behind it. Only then does the soul, for the first time, feel united with an essence that forms the basis of the world, and precedes all that one can observe as a sensory, etheric, and astral being. Eventually, then, we shall feel ourselves to be in a still higher realm than those spiritual worlds we have come to know. We shall call this world, which only the I can experience, the supra-spiritual world. Seen from that world, even the realm of thought reality appears as an external world. If you follow the path of suprasensory consciousness through its various stages, suprasensory consciousness will attain an experience that we can describe approximately as follows. Once the soul feels itself within the etheric body, and feels that its environment is the elemental processes and beings, then it knows it is outside the physical body. Although the physical body, when seen from without, is transformed, it remains present as a real being. viewed by spiritual vision, it breaks into two parts. One expresses the deeds of spiritual beings who have been active since the beginning of Earth existence. The other expresses what had already been present during the Earth's moon existence. This is how things remain as long as consciousness experiences itself only in the elemental world. In that world, consciousness can discover how the human being as a physical being was formed during the moon state. When consciousness enters the spiritual world, yet another part of the physical body separates off. This is the part formed by the deeds of spiritual beings during the moon state. Another part remains behind. This is the part that was present as our physical human nature during the Earth's sun state. But when we consider from the perspective of the spiritual world all that occurred during the sun period as a result of the activities of spiritual beings, we see that something of that physical nature still remains. What remains reveals itself as the deed of spiritual beings from the supra-spiritual world. We can see that it was already present at the beginning of the sun period. Therefore, to find the origins of the physical human body, we must go back to an earth state preceding the sun period. In my book, titled An Outline of Esoteric Science, I tried to justify calling that condition of the Earth's existence the Saturn state. In this sense, the Earth was Saturn before it became Sun. During that Saturn state, the first outline of the human physical body arose from general cosmic processes through the deeds of spiritual beings. During the following sun and moon periods, as well as during our present Earth period, these rudiments were transformed through the activities of other spiritual beings to become the present human physical body. The end of Aphorism 11. This is a reading of the book The Threshold of the Spiritual World by Rudolf Штайнер. This is Aphorism 12, entitled The True I of the Human Being. When the soul experiences itself in the astral body, in an environment of living thought beings, it knows that it is outside the physical and etheric bodies. It feels that its thinking, feeling, and willing belong to a limited area of the world, but that its own primal being could encompass much more. Thus, in the spiritual world, the clairvoyant soul can recognize that, quote, "In the physical world, I am confined to what I can observe through my senses. In the elemental world, the etheric body limits me. In the spiritual world, I am bound to the extent that I find myself upon a cosmic island, and I can feel my spiritual existence extending only as far as its shores. But beyond those shores is a world I could perceive if I could penetrate the veil woven before my spiritual eye, EYE, by the deeds of living thought beings," unquote. The soul can work its way through this veil if it continues to unfold the capacity for unreserved devotion and sacrifice it needs for life in the elemental world. In order to be protected from the reduction, darkening, and even the annihilation of consciousness that can occur in the suprasensory worlds, it must continue to strengthen those powers that grow through sensory experience. In the physical world, in order to experience thoughts within itself, the soul needs only its naturally given strength. In the elemental world, those thoughts are reduced to become dreamlike experiences, which are forgotten the very moment they arise. That is, if the soul, before entering the elemental world, has not worked to strengthen its own inner life, its thoughts there will not be at all conscious. Above all, the soul must strengthen the force of its will, because in the elemental world thoughts are not just thoughts, but something with their own inner activity and their own life. In the elemental world, the will must hold on to thoughts, or they will withdraw from the sphere of consciousness. In the spiritual world, thoughts are completely independent living beings. There, for thoughts to remain in consciousness, the soul must be able to unfold the same strength within itself that the physical body unfolds for it in the sensory world, and the etheric body's elemental sympathies and antipathies develop for it in the etheric world. In the spiritual world, however, the soul must relinquish all these. The experiences of the physical and elemental worlds exist there only as memories, and the soul itself is outside these two worlds. The spiritual world surrounds it. At first, this spiritual world makes no impression upon the astral body. The soul must learn to live by itself, on its own memories. Initially, the content of its consciousness is only, I was, now I stand before nothingness. But when memories arise out of experiences that are not simply reflections of sensory or elemental processes, but that instead represent free thought experiences arising from these processes, then a conversation in thoughts begins in the soul between those memories and the apparent nothingness of the spiritual world. And what arises as a result of that conversation becomes the conceptual world within the astral body's consciousness. At this point in its development, the soul needs the strength to enable it to stand at the shore of the only world it has known and confront the apparent nothingness before it. This apparent nothingness is at first a true nothingness for the life of the soul. Yet in a sense, the soul still has the world of its memories behind it. It may, as it were, hold on to those memories. It may live within them. And the more it holds on to them, the stronger becomes the forces of the astral body. With that strengthening begins the conversation between the soul's previous existence and the beings of the spiritual world. In this conversation, the soul comes to experience itself as an astral being. To use an expression reflective of ancient traditions, the soul experiences itself as an astral being in the cosmic word. By cosmic word, I mean the cognitive deeds of thought beings that occur as living conversation among spirit beings in the spiritual world. Such spiritual conversations are, for the spiritual world, exactly the same as deeds are for the sensory world. If the soul now wishes to enter the supra-spiritual world, it must wipe out all its memories of the physical and elemental worlds through its own will. It can do this only if the experience of spiritual conversation has made it feel certain that it will not completely lose its own existence, even if everything that until now made it conscious of that existence is destroyed. The soul must place itself before a spiritual abyss, and there seize the will to forget its willing, feeling, and thinking. It must renounce the past in its consciousness. We could describe this decision as the resolution to bring about a complete sleep of consciousness. This is done not by the condition of our physical or etheric body, but through our own will. But this decision must not be made with the intention of returning, after a period of unconsciousness, to our previous state of consciousness. Rather, our intention must be for our consciousness only to enter oblivion by its own will. We must remember that we can enter oblivion in this way only in the spiritual world. We cannot do so in the physical or elemental worlds. In the physical world, annihilation, which appears as death, is possible, whereas in the elemental world there is no death. To the extent that human beings are part of the elemental world, they cannot die. They only change into other beings. In the spiritual world, too, no decisive transformation in the strict sense is possible. For there, no matter what you may change into, what you have experienced in the past reveals itself as your own conscious existence. For that memory existence in the spiritual world to disappear, the soul must force it to sink into oblivion by a willed decision. Suprasensory consciousness can arrive at that willed decision only if it has won the necessary strength of soul. When this happens, the true nature of the I arises out of the oblivion that the soul called forth. The supra-spiritual environment gives the human soul knowledge of this true I. Just as suprasensory consciousness can experience itself in the etheric and astral bodies, so can it also experience itself in the true I. Spiritual vision does not create the true I, for the I is present in the depths of every human soul. Suprasensory consciousness merely experiences knowingly something previously unknown to the human soul, something which nonetheless belongs to its nature. After physical death, human beings gradually grow into the spiritual environment. We emerge there, at first, with memories of the sensory world. Although we no longer have the support of our physical bodies, we are nevertheless able to live consciously in those memories, because the corresponding living thought beings clothe themselves within them. Thus, memories in the spiritual environment after death no longer have the kind of shadowy existence they had in the physical world. Then, at a point in time between death and a new birth, those living thought beings of the spiritual environment act with such strength that without our willing it, the previously described process of forgetting occurs. At that same time, experience in the true I rises to the surface. By strengthening the soul's life, clairvoyant consciousness brings about as a free spiritual deed something that occurs, so to speak, naturally between death and birth. Nevertheless, the memory of a previous earthly life can occur in physical experience only when in that earthly life we have turned our thoughts and concepts toward the spiritual world. For a clearly recognizable memory of something to arise in consciousness, we must have known of it earlier. Thus, to be able justifiably to expect to remember a previous earthly life during the one following it, we must acquire knowledge of ourselves as spiritual beings during this present earthly life. This knowledge need not be gained through clairvoyance. But for those who gain direct knowledge of the spiritual world through clairvoyance, a memory of a former life can arise in the soul during earthly lives that follow the one in which they gained the knowledge. This memory is like a memory within sensory existence of something one has experienced for oneself. A memory occurs of something that was experienced. For those who penetrate spiritual science with understanding, even if without spiritual vision, that memory is comparable to those we have in sensory existence of events that we have only heard described. That is the end of aphorism 12, and this is the summary. As human beings, we bear within ourselves a true I, which belongs to a supra-spiritual world. In the sensory world, this true I is concealed by our experiences of thinking, feeling, and willing. Even in the spiritual world, we first become aware of it only when we extinguish in ourselves the memory of all that we can experience through thinking, feeling, and willing. Knowledge of the true I arises out of the forgetting of everything experienced in the sensory, elemental, and spiritual worlds. The human physical body reveals its true nature when the soul considers it from the supra-spiritual world. It then becomes evident that the rudimentary outlines of the human physical body came into being during the general cosmic processes at work in the Earth's Saturn state. The physical body developed into what it is now in the Earth's subsequent Sun, Moon, and Earth phases. In line with the above, we can consider the entire nature of the human being schematically as follows. Through the physical body, in the sensory environment, human beings recognize themselves as independent I beings. This physical body was formed, in its rudimentary outlines, during a far distant Saturn stage of the Earth. It developed into what it is now during the Earth's 4 planetary transformations. Through the subtle or etheric body in the elemental environment, human beings recognize themselves as members of the Earth's living body. The first outlines of this etheric body were formed from universal cosmic existence during the Earth's Sun stage. It then developed into what it now is during the Sun, Moon, and Earth stages of planetary transformation. Through the astral body in a spiritual environment, human beings are part of a spiritual world. The astral body contains the other self, which realizes and expresses itself through repeated earthly lives. Finally, through the true I, in a supra-spiritual environment, human beings discover themselves as spiritual beings, even though all experience of the sensory, elemental, and spiritual worlds, that is, all experience of the senses of thinking, feeling, and willing, pass into oblivion. That is the end of the summary. I'm also going to add here another small section entitled Remarks on the Relationship of the Descriptions Given Here to those given in in title Theosophy and title An Outline of Esoteric Science. The words used to describe the soul's experiences in the elemental and spiritual worlds must be adapted to the special quality of those experiences. In naming them, we need to be aware that experiences in the elemental world are quite different from experiences in the sensory world. The basis of those experiences is the soul's capacity for transformation and its awareness of sympathies and antipathies. The terms used will necessarily reflect something of the changing nature of those experiences. Therefore, the terms are not as fixed as they would be when used for the sensory world. Those who do not take this into account will easily find contradictions between the terms used in this volume and those used in my books titled Theosophy and titled An Outline of Esoteric Science. We can resolve those contradictions by recalling that in both those texts, terms were chosen to characterize the soul's experiences during the whole developmental period between birth, conception, and death, and between death and rebirth. In this book, on the other hand, terms were chosen that would be appropriate to the experiences of clairvoyant consciousness when it enters the elemental world and the spiritual realms. From title Theosophy and title An Outline of Esoteric Science, you learn that soon after the soul separates from the physical body with death, the body I have here called the etheric body also separates from the soul. The soul then lives in the being I refer to as the astral body. After separation from the soul, the etheric body is transformed in the elemental world. It merges into the beings that form the elemental world. In that metamorphosis, the human soul no longer accompanies the etheric body. At the same time, the soul, after death, experiences the processes in the elemental world as its outer world. Title Theosophy and title An Outline of Esoteric Science describe experience in the elemental world from the outside, as the soul's passage through the soul world. Thus, we must think of what I there call the soul world as the same as what, from the perspective of suprasensory consciousness, I here call the elemental world. Therefore, between death and birth, when the soul separates from the astral body, as described in title Theosophy, the soul continues to exist in the being referred to here as the true I. In order that the soul should no longer accompany it, the astral body then does what is characterized here as forgetting. In a sense, it plunges into a world where there remains nothing that it can perceive through the senses or experience through willing, feeling, and thinking as they developed in the human physical body. The soul's true I then experiences that world as its outer world. If we wished to characterize the experiences in that outer world, we could describe the journey through the spiritual realm, as is done in title Theosophy and title An Outline of Esoteric Science. When the soul experiences itself in the true I, in the spiritual world, it has around it what formed within it as soul experiences during sensory existence. Between death and birth, within the world described here as that of living thought beings, the soul finds everything in its inner existence that it experienced through its sensory perceptions and through thinking, feeling, and willing. That is the end of the book. There will be an afterword attached as well, however. This is a reading of Rudolf Steiner's book, The Threshold of the Spiritual World, and this is the afterword to the 1918 edition. When a soul wishes to acquire the capacity to penetrate knowingly into the supersensory world, it must first strengthen its powers so that it can, from within outward, develop an activity that is fundamentally picturing in nature. But such imagining or visualizing must be exercised to a greater degree than it is in ordinary consciousness, where it is used in connection with sensory perception. There, imagining is much weaker than perception. If imagining were practiced with only that ordinary intensity, the soul would never develop the faculties for entering the supersensory world. Although imaginative representation or picturing remains just that, it must become as strong as perception. It cannot stay at the level where it weaves a shadowy copy of visible things. It must concentrate itself into actual visible images. One creates living images. But in suprasensory perception, you do not use your soul's strength only to linger in these images. You direct your attention away from the images themselves and toward your own activity of creating them. By doing so, you will find an inwardly strengthened self-awareness. As you practice this soul exercise for weeks, months, or perhaps longer, you may also notice that by becoming aware of your strengthened self-awareness, you enter into a relationship with the suprasensory world. At first, contact with that world is chaotic. You experience it through general feeling impressions. Slowly, however, an objective, differentiated world of images forms out of the chaos. You will then realize that your practice of creating images now makes it possible for outer spiritual reality to weave together with the images produced by your strengthened self-awareness. These images reveal themselves to be reflections of an objective suprasensory world. More precisely, this is the experience the images woven in soul encountered by the soul on its way to the spiritual world. See Aphorism 2. If while striving for suprasensory consciousness you clearly experience these inner processes, you will find them to be an infallible way to distinguish suprasensory reality from illusory fantasy. In Aphorism 2 I write that the images of a consciousness at the beginning of suprasensory experience, quote, are initially a kind of curtain that the soul places between itself and the suprasensory world when it feels touched by that world, unquote. The use of the word curtain is justified, for at first those images serve only to raise self-awareness into the suprasensory world. By means of the images, you experience yourself as a spiritual being, but you do not see through them any objective suprasensory outer world. It is like having sightless, unilluminated eyes in your physical organism. The outer world cannot unfold its activities to them. In a sense, you have to allow your own constant activity within the pictures, weaving in your soul, to render them spiritually transparent. Let me read that sentence again. In a sense, you have to allow your own constant activity within the pictures, weaving in your soul, to render them spiritually transparent. Gradually they will become transparent through their own development. They will become such that you no longer see them, but you feel them living in your soul. And through that living feeling in the soul, you perceive the nature of suprasensory reality. As we enter the suprasensory world, one of the first perceptions our heightened self-awareness initially enables us to see is how we are connected to the beings of that world through sympathies and antipathies. Aphorism 9. These experiences make us aware that to enter the suprasensory world, our thinking must leave the sensory world. You can, of course, describe what you see in the suprasensory world with images taken from the sensory world. For example, you could say that a being reveals itself through the appearance of colors. Those who hear such descriptions of suprasensory beings, however, should never forget that a genuine spiritual researcher intends to say only that what he or she experienced is something like the impression of the corresponding color on sensory consciousness. Those who imply by their description that what was before their consciousness was the same as sensory color is not a spiritual researcher, but a visionary or a victim of hallucinations. Experiences of sympathy and antipathy, however, present the first suprasensory impressions of the suprasensory world. Some people are deeply disappointed when spiritual researchers say that they use images taken from the sensory world only to illustrate what they see in the suprasensory world. Such people do not really strive to know a suprasensory world different from the sensory. They want the suprasensory world to be a kind of double of the sensory world. They think that the suprasensory world should merely be subtler, more etheric than the sensible world. They believe that understanding it should not require thoughts any different from those needed to understand the sensory world. Those who truly wish to approach the spiritual world must become comfortable with acquiring new thoughts and new ideas. Those who can imagine only a watered-down, misty duplicate of the sensory world will never grasp the suprasensory world. The power of memory, a well-practiced human capacity that plays such a significant role in the soul life of ordinary consciousness, plays no such role in perceiving the suprasensory world. In order not to misunderstand Aphorism 9, you must take that into account. The human soul possesses the power of memory for its life in the physical world. This is because it exercises its activity in this life through its bodily organization. When the elevated soul faces beings and processes in the suprasensory world, it no longer exercises the power of memory. At first, the soul can only view what that world presents, but no memory of those impressions remains after the soul returns to its physical body. However, this situation does not continue. The soul takes from its experience in the physical world an echo